The church sits on a two-lane road outside a mid-sized agricultural town, the kind of place where the water tower has the high school mascot painted on it. A converted feed store with a new steel roof and a gravel lot. On Sundays, the lot fills with pickup trucks and minivans. On Wednesdays, it fills with something else. Vans that carry teenagers, mostly boys between 15 and 19, who arrived in the country with no parents, no papers, and no one waiting for them. The man who runs the outreach is 38, married, a daughter in the 3rd grade. He wears a lanyard with a laminated badge that says Youth Ministry, and he remembers everyone's name after the first meeting. The local paper ran a feature on him 2 years earlier under the headline, Shepherd to the Forgotten. There's a photograph. He's standing in the church kitchen ladling soup, surrounded by young men who are laughing. Hold on to that photograph. Homeland Security investigations would eventually enter it into evidence. The program was called Bridge of Hope, and on paper it was exactly what it claimed to be. A faith-based re-entry and mentorship ministry for unaccompanied migrant minors and recent arrivals. Free English classes on Tuesday nights, a food pantry, a ride to the county courthouse for immigration hearings, and job placement. The pastor knew farmers. He knew the packing plant. He knew a labor contractor who supplied crews to 3 counties. He could get a kid working within a week of walking through the door. For a teenager alone in a strange country, that was everything. Work meant money. Money meant survival. And the man offering it wore a cross around his neck and prayed with them before dinner. The first thread didn't come from the church. It came from a hospital. In March, an emergency room 50 miles away admitted a 19-year-old with a crushed hand and a fever that suggested the injury was days old. He gave a name that didn't match any record. He said he worked for the church crew. He wouldn't say more. A social worker flagged the case to a state anti-trafficking hotline. The hotline flagged it to the HSI field office, and a case agent named Dana Reyes pulled the file on a Thursday afternoon and couldn't put it down. Reyes had spent 9 years working labor trafficking cases. She knew the pattern before she could prove it. A young worker afraid to explain his injury. A crew tied to a charity. A missing paper trail. She opened a preliminary inquiry. She expected it to close in a month. It didn't close for 14. Here's the first thing that made the case hard. The victims didn't see themselves as victims. That's the cruelest mechanism in a labor trafficking operation dressed as charity. And it's the reason these cases can run for years in plain sight. The teenagers were being paid, not fairly, but paid. They were being housed, not well, but housed. And the man taking most of their wages was the same man who drove them to church, who wrote letters to their immigration judges, who was, as far as they understood the world, the only person in the country who had ever helped them. So when Reyes tried to build a witness list, she hit a wall. The 19-year-old with the crushed hand checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice and vanished. The address he gave was a field. Reyes needed a different way in. She found it in payroll. The labor contractor who supplied the church's crews was a real company, a licensed farm labor contractor, registered with the state, filing taxes. So I subpoenaed the payroll records. On paper, the workers were adults with valid authorization documents, but the documents repeated. The same social security number appeared under 4 different names across 2 seasons. A single mailing address, a P.O. box registered to Bridge of Hope, received the paychecks for 11 separate workers. 11 checks, 1 box. 1 man with the key. That was the moment Reyes stopped thinking of it as a wage dispute and started thinking of it as trafficking under 18, USC Section 1589, forced labor. The statute doesn't require chains. It requires coercion, threats, abuse of law or legal process, a scheme designed to make the victim believe that leaving would bring serious harm. Debt, deportation, the loss of the only protector they had. The pastor, the government would later allege, controlled all three. You might wonder why the workers didn't simply leave, walk off a farm, get on a bus. The answer is in the documents HSI pulled next. Each teenager placed through Bridge of Hope had signed a mentorship covenant, a 2-page contract that assigned a program debt for housing, transportation, and legal advocacy to be repaid from wages. The debt never went down. Rent was deducted for a bunkhouse that slept 9 to a room. Transportation was deducted for the church van. Legal advocacy was deducted whether or not a hearing occurred. And the pastor held the identity documents, real and fabricated, in a locked cabinet in his office. A boy who wanted to leave had no ID, no savings, and an outstanding debt to the ministry that he'd been told from the pulpit was a spiritual obligation. He used scripture as a lock. That's the detail that made the agents who read the file go quiet. By summer, Reyes had a financial skeleton, but no living witness willing to speak. HSI brought in a second tool, an undercover operation. A cooperating source, a former volunteer who had grown uneasy and reached out through a Catholic charity, agreed to introduce an undercover agent into the ministry as a new congregant looking to donate and help with job placement. The agent attended 3 Wednesday classes and 2 Sunday services over 5 weeks. What the undercover documented wasn't abuse. What the reports documented was structure. The pastor openly described his boys as an asset to local farmers. He negotiated crew rates directly with the labor contractor in the church parking lot. He referred to specific teenagers by the debts they carried, and on one recording, entered later into the record, he explained to the undercover, believing him a fellow believer and potential partner, how the covenant kept the young men from wandering off before the season ends. Before the season ends. Like they were equipment. The recordings gave HSI probable cause. But probable cause isn't the same as a case that survives trial, and Reyes knew the difference. She needed at least one victim who would testify. That meant reaching a teenager while he was still inside the operation, still afraid, still convinced the pastor was the only safe adult he knew, and convincing him otherwise without spooking the target. The break came from the crushed hand. HSI located the 19-year-old, named in the filings as a cooperating witness, so we'll call him what the documents call him. Witness 1. He was living in a second bunkhouse 2 counties over. He'd been moved after the hospital visit. Reyes and a victim specialist named Carol Okafor approached him not as agents, but through the same Catholic charity that had produced the original source. It took 4 meetings. Okafor brought a certified interpreter and a promise she was legally able to make. Cooperation could support a T visa, the immigration protection Congress created specifically for trafficking victims who assist law enforcement. For the first time, leaving didn't mean deportation. Leaving meant a path forward. Witness 1 talked. Then a second worker talked. Then a third, a 17-year-old who had aged into the program from a shelter and who could describe the locked cabinet, the covenant signing, the Sunday sermons about debt and obedience. 3 witnesses, a financial trail, undercover recordings, a payroll fraud tied to a registered contractor who was now staring at conspiracy exposure and deciding fast that he'd rather cooperate than co-defend. The contractor flipped in October. That was the domino. With the contractor's records and testimony, HSI could show the full shape. Teenagers recruited through a trusted ministry, placed into farm and packing labor, paid below minimum wage, with the balance seized against a manufactured debt, controlled through document confiscation, and the constant, quiet threat that any complaint would end in immigration custody.
The government estimated the operation had moved at least 23 young workers over roughly 3 years and diverted somewhere near $400,000 in withheld and recovered wages into accounts the pastor controlled, some routed through the church's nonprofit books to look like program revenue. $400,000 laundered through a food pantry. Here's my one honest opinion in this. The worst part of this case isn't the money, and it isn't even the coercion. It's that the operation worked precisely because it wore the one uniform no one in that town would ever question. A predator in a warehouse gets caught. A predator behind a pulpit gets a newspaper feature. The disguise was the crime's whole engine. By late spring of the following year, the U.S. Attorney's Office was ready. A grand jury returned a sealed indictment charging forced labor under Section 1589, conspiracy to commit forced labor under Section 1594, document servitude under Section 1592, the statute that specifically criminalizes confiscating identity documents to hold someone in servitude, and financial counts tied to the diverted wages. The statutory maximum stacked well past 20 years. Now there was only the question of how to take him. You don't arrest a man like this at church. HSI made that decision early. Arresting him in front of the congregation risked turning a trafficker into a martyr, risked the community rallying to his defense before they understood the charges, and risked the safety of witnesses whose faces were known in that building. The plan called for a residential arrest at dawn, coordinated with a simultaneous search of the church office and the bunkhouses, so the locked cabinet, the documents, could be secured before anyone thought to empty it. Which brings us back to 4:52 in the morning. The arrest team is led by Dana Reyes, 11 agents across 3 locations, 2 entry teams at the residence, a forced entry element on standby at the church a mile away, and a victim response unit, Carol Okafor's people, positioned near the bunkhouses with interpreters and social workers. The moment those doors open, young men will wake up to the collapse of the only structure they've known in this country, and the government's obligation to them starts in that instant, not later. At 4:54, the knock and announce. Lights. Voices. The door opens on a man in a t-shirt who blinks at the badges and says softly that there must be a mistake, that this is a house of God's work. He's handcuffed in his own driveway under a porch light his daughter helped pick out. He doesn't resist. Men in this position rarely do. The performance of respectability is a reflex, and he keeps it up all the way to the vehicle. His wife watches from the doorway, holding their daughter. Neither says a word. At the church, the second team secures the office. The cabinet is exactly where Witness 1 said it would be. Inside, 41 identity documents, a ledger of covenant debts in the pastor's own handwriting, and a spiral notebook tracking which teenager owed what and which farmer paid when. The notebook alone is a confession. Agents photograph everything in place before it moves. At the bunkhouses, the harder work begins. 9 young men in one, 6 in another. Okafor's team doesn't lead with badges. They lead with a sentence, delivered through interpreters. You are not in trouble, and you do not owe anyone anything anymore. Some of them don't believe it. One cries. One asks if the pastor is okay. That question, asked by a 17-year-old about the man who had taken his wages and his passport, is the whole tragedy of the case in 5 words. By 7 a.m., the town is waking up to squad vehicles outside the feed store church. The community reaction, documented in local news over the following days, split exactly as HSI feared. Some congregants refused to believe it, organized a prayer vigil, called the charges a government attack on faith-based outreach. Others, quieter, later, came forward to say they'd wondered about the vans, the deaths, the boys who never seemed to leave. A church elder told a reporter he'd asked about the finances once and been told it was between the pastor and the Lord. Between the pastor and the Lord.
And 41 identity documents in a locked cabinet.
Here's the part viewers argue about in the comments. The bystanders in that congregation aren't innocent, and neither is the comfortable machinery of trust that let a charity operate for 3 years with a P.O. box collecting 11 paychecks and nobody official asking why. I'll defend that. Not because those churchgoers committed a crime, they didn't, but because a town's willingness to never question the man with the cross is exactly the vulnerability the operation was engineered to exploit. The cover only works if people agree not to look. The prosecution never went to trial. It rarely does when the ledger is in the defendant's handwriting. After his attorneys reviewed the recordings, the payroll subpoenas, the contractor's cooperation, and the statements of 3 victim witnesses backed by a T-visa framework that made them stable and credible, the pastor entered a plea. In the sentencing memorandum, prosecutors laid out the years, the dollar figure, the number of young workers, and the aggravating fact that carried the most weight with the court. He had used a position of trust and religious authority as the instrument of the coercion. The court sentenced him to just over 17 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release, and ordered restitution to the identified victims for the wages seized against the manufactured deaths.
The labor contractor, having cooperated, received a substantially reduced sentence and forfeited his license. 2 co-conspirators tied to the bunkhouses, one of them undocumented himself, were charged. One was convicted and, after serving his term, placed into removal proceedings, the deportation that so often forms the last line of these files. Now, the question a careful viewer asks, what happened to the young men? A channel about enforcement can forget that the enforcement was supposed to be for someone. Witness 1 received his T-visa. Under that status, trafficking survivors who cooperate can eventually apply to remain lawfully and, after the required years, pursue permanent residency. The 17-year-old was placed with a licensed sponsor through a vetted program and finished high school. Not every one of the 23 the government identified could be located. Some had already been moved again, lost to the same shadow economy the operation fed. That's the part with no clean ending. HSI closes a case. The vulnerability that made the case possible stays open.
14 months of surveillance, 11 agents at dawn, 41 documents in a cabinet, $400,000 routed through a food pantry, and a photograph, still findable online, of a smiling man in a church kitchen labeling soup for the young men whose passports he was keeping in a locked drawer a room away. Go back to that headline,
Shepherd to the Forgotten. The paper meant it as praise. Read it now, knowing what the cabinet held, and it means something the editor never intended. That the forgotten were exactly who the operation was built to find first. Because no one comes looking for the ones no one is missing. That's the mechanism. That's why HSI watched for a year before they knocked. And that's why the knock came at 4:52 in the morning, before the town could wake up and decide, one more time, not to look.